Okay, last year's kick six, followed by too many kicks for Auburn, and finally kicked to the curb by the high-kicking Amari. Guess who has the SEC's best record in the last 2 years? Yes, it's Mizzou at 14-2, back to Atlanta for the Tigers and the Bulldogs with egg on their face. But does Hail State still have hope that chaos gets them into the college football playoff? Yes, this is the SEC in 60. This is your SEC football show, and it's all football all the time, every week, 52 weeks a year. The SEC in 60 comes at you every Monday, so we do this live on Google Hangouts at noon Eastern Time, 11 Central, every Monday. We thank Dr. SEC for welcoming us to the SEC Fans Radio Network, so you can catch us every day for the rest of the week. So that's at 2 o'clock Eastern and 1 o'clock Central on the SECRadioNetwork.com. We also post this video to YouTube at my channel there, MarkRogersTV, and also post it to MarkRogersTV.com. It's available in a podcast. So if you're on the move, on the go, working out, doing your chores, catch us audio only on our podcast. And of course, follow me on Twitter at MarkRogersTV. And also, I've got a Facebook fan page. Give me a big like there on the Facebook fan page. Then you can trash me when you give me some comments, but give me the initial like to at least get us started, and then we'll go from there. Got a great show headed our way today with Joe Lisi from GoForThe2.com. Got Stephen M. Smith from TouchdownAlabama.net. He's on the no-sleep team, as he likes to say, and also Brittnee Taylor Newman of Football.com and a last word on sports. So before we get to Joe, I'd like to cover a couple things that came across my path this weekend in amongst all the chaos across college football. Heard a lot of talk yesterday about the ACC sweeping the SEC 4 straight games. So you got Florida State over Florida, Clemson, South Carolina, Louisville, Kentucky, Georgia Tech, Georgia. So good for the ACC. They won 4 games against those traditional SEC rivals. So it wasn't like the big boys of the ACC picking on the lesser ranks in the SEC, saying, let's schedule some of the lesser teams in the SEC so we can beat them up and say we went 4-0. These are traditional rivalries. They're scheduled every year. So let's credit the ACC for going on the field and winning the games on the field. Well, let's put this into some context here. Florida State. Florida State's the best team in the ACC. Do we have an argument there? I don't believe we do until possibly next Saturday. Florida State wins that game in a tight one. Jameis Winston with the 4 picks. Florida, with that anemic offense, can't convert those interceptions into real big points. They can't score the touchdowns and convert there. The game really turned on that 9-zip play. So the Gators are up 9-zip. They're driving after another Winston pick, and they get the tip pick themselves, and it comes back the other way. Tevin Smith makes it 9-7. But let's keep in mind, Florida State's the 1 seed in the ACC, Florida the 8th seed. If you go through the standings, Florida would be the 8th seed in the SEC. Clemson, South Carolina, the Tigers really showed up defensively. We saw what the Gamecocks have on D, and it pretty much ran the thread from game 1 against Texas A&M and Kenny Hill all the way through the season for South Carolina. But again, credit Clemson, because they're as happy as can be in Clemson, because they lost 5 straight to their hated rivals, and they finally get the win. They were the much better football team, 35-17, but they would be the 3 seed in the ACC against the 10 seed South Carolina. Louisville, Kentucky, pretty much the same thing. The Cardinals have come to the ACC. They're going to be a force. They would be the 4th seed in the ACC. Kentucky, the 13th seed. Vandy's the only team that you would rank lower than Kentucky at 2-6 in the ACC. Finally, the best game of the day and the best matchup, and the only real comparable game you could throw out there would be Georgia Tech and Georgia. Yellow Jackets win it in OT 30-24. Georgia Tech moving to the ACC championship game. The 2 seed, Georgia, if you check out the rankings, of course, they're behind Mizzou in the East. You got to rank a couple teams ahead of them in the West, Mississippi State and Alabama. 2 seed, 4 seed, comparable game, good win for the ACC there. So credit again, the ACC for winning the scheduled games on the field. This does not prove that the ACC is better than the SEC. The SEC is still much better than the ACC. We would have to have Florida State, Alabama, have to have Clemson, Mississippi State, Georgia Tech, Mizzou, and the like. Okay. At the same time, if you look across the board, the SEC went 5-6 against the Power 5 conferences. 5-6. And that includes beating up on some teams that were lower ranked. Alabama, West Virginia, and the like. The ACC, got to credit the ACC, considered the worst of the Power 5s. They went 10-6 against the other Power 5 conferences. 10-6, and again, aside from these games, they weren't beaten up on inferior teams. They were pretty much matched up against comparable seeds. Had a Twitter debate yesterday with Mr. Yesh Ginsburg of Last Word on Sports. Yesh does some great breakdown analysis, but we just couldn't get on the same page with this one. Says if Alabama wins the SEC or loses, if Alabama loses the SEC championship game, they should get the nod over Mizzou. I'm a guy who believes that conference championships mean something. I'm a guy who thinks that head-to-head, especially at that stage in the season, last game, same conference. So their schedules are more comparable than you would think. I know Mizzou plays in the East. Alabama plays in the mighty SEC West, which is slightly overrated. The SEC West, but the schedules are pretty comparable. They came out pretty comparable against three like opponents in Tennessee, Florida, and Arkansas. Mizzou handled those three teams just about as well as Alabama did. So let's look at that. So if Mizzou wins that head-to-head matchup, they are the SEC champion. They should go to the college football playoff if other factors play in their favor. So my top four, it goes against everybody else in the country. My top four, and of course we'll see the official rankings coming out on Tuesday night. Florida State 1, Oregon 2, Alabama 3. I separate Florida State because they've won every game. As soon as they would lose a game, which at this stage in the season they'd be out, but if they would lose a game, let's say they would have lost the Clemson game or to somebody else, then you start to compare resumes across the board against the other Power 5 teams that are at one loss. But the way I do it is I say Florida State's undefeated. I don't care how they got it done. They are the only undefeated team in college football, and they've done it against a better schedule than you think. If you really go game to game, Florida State versus like an Alabama, their schedule's better than you think. Florida State 1, Oregon 2. I break the tie with the Crimson Tide here. Oregon played a much better Michigan State team than Alabama did West Virginia team out of conference. And again, the Pac-12 and the SEC, why don't these conferences get together? 56 non-conference games for the SEC. They couldn't schedule one against the Pac-12. 56 non-conference games. They could only schedule 11 against the other Power 5. That's criminal. We cannot be judging teams and going through this process of trying to determine conferences and who's better across conferences, scheduling 11 Power 5 conference games out of 56. And the other conferences aren't a whole lot better, but the SEC, the biggest criminal in this particular situation with the 11 games in 56 non-conference. Got Bama 3, Ohio State breaking the time. We won't go through the whole decision process there, but I'm going to let the J.T. Barrett situation ride until we see what happens against Wisconsin. The Badgers, a very good football team, definitely a top 10 to 15 team in college football. I believe the power rankings right now have them at 10. We'll see what the College Football Playoff Committee has to say about the Badgers. I would believe around 12 or 13 in the country. So I got Florida State 1, Oregon 2, Bama 3, Ohio State 4. I'm sure people will really go to town on that. And if you'd like to discuss and leave me your comments, of course, follow me on Twitter. All right, it's time for Joe Lisi for GoForThe2.com. Joe, how are you today? Hopefully Joe can hear me. Joe, how are you? Joe, unfortunately, we can't hear you right now.
How about now, Mark? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I got you. How are things?
Good. Another great weekend within the SEC. It just keeps getting better as we get closer to this playoff now, don't we?
Yeah, that Iron Bowl was pretty serious, at least for about 3 quarters or so. Auburn tore up Bama's secondary, but Bama did the same to them and made some better plays on defense and really hit up Auburn in the red zone or in the red zone and forced the 5 field goals. So it meant so much that Ellis Johnson Auburn's defensive coordinator, lost his job. So in the midst of 55-44, can you give us a breakdown of what you saw out there?
Well, I think I said it prior to the game on Saturday night that I really thought that the Alabama secondary was vulnerable over the middle of the field, and the ability of Duke Williams and Sammy Coates to stretch that secondary would give Alabama problems. For the first 3 quarters, it seemed that way. They were giving up the big play, but in the end, it was Alabama's ability to create a turnover that really changed the tide of that ball game, down 36-34. That, in my estimation, was the turning point of the game. And then the defensive line for Auburn in the fourth quarter, in my opinion, just wore out. They were without Devontae Lambert, who was lost for the rest of the year with a knee injury. He hurt that defensive line. But you really have to credit Auburn for exploiting some of the holes in that Alabama defense. Amari Cooper proved why, in my opinion, he 224 yards, 3 touchdowns, and then Blake Sims' ability to bounce back from 3 early interceptions, the most resolve for the Alabama Crimson Tide. And you have to credit the number 1.
Okay, Joe, we're having a few issues hearing some of that, but so Blake Sims throws the 3 picks, and Jay Coker's warming up on the sideline. Of course, they were still good enough to throw up 55 points on Auburn despite the 3 turnovers in the passing game. But Blake Sims throwing 3 picks in another game the rest of this season, maybe they could survive Missouri with 3 interceptions, but they're not going to win a college football playoff game, I don't think, throwing 3 interceptions.
I agree with you, and that's been the MO of this team in 2014. They've been negative in turnover margin. They lost the turnover battle again on Saturday night, 3-2. So going forward, these games are going to be on a neutral field site where Alabama has not played well this year. They played very solid at home in Tuscaloosa, but on the road, they showed some vulnerability. You look at that game against Arkansas, lost actually even in turnover margin, but they won that game by a point. They lost to Ole Miss on the road. They got challenged by West Virginia opening day on a neutral field site in the Georgia Dome. So Alabama this year has not looked that solid on the road or on a neutral field site, and going forward, they're going to have to win the turnover battle in the SEC championship game and in the playoff game if they are to make it to a national championship appearance.
It really surprises me, Joe, that with those 5-star laden recruiting classes of Alabama, that they have not had a dynamic speed edge rusher for the last several seasons since they had those great defenses from 2009 to 2012. The last few years, they have really lacked putting, consistently serious pressure on the quarterback. You look at teams around the country, Joey Bosa at Ohio State, you see Shane Ray and Marcus Golden at Mizzou, you see the elite teams, the better teams with guys that can really get after the quarterback, that one guy, Leonard Williams with USC, and I don't see it from Alabama, and I think that this could hurt them, again, depending on the matchup they get with quarterbacks and wide receiver talent.
You're right about that, Mark. It's not the days since Derek Thomas and Cornelius Bennett roamed the sidelines on Tuscaloosa for the Alabama Crimson Tide, even Keith and McCants back in the day. This is a different Alabama team. Nick Saban, a secondary coach, so you have to keep that in mind. He likes to build the depth within the secondary and the linebackers. To him, that's where they can roam sideline to sideline, come up and run support, and that's been the MO of Nick Saban's defense. He has solid defensive tackles which create double teams which allow those linebackers to fill in run support, and that's how he builds the defense for Kirby Smart in terms of recruiting. They really haven't had an edge pass rusher like a Vic Beasley out there that could really create some havoc in the backfield. So even LSU, you look at a couple of years ago, they had Sam Montgomery and Kevius Mingo, 2 edge rushers for the LSU Tigers. Alabama's built a little bit differently. They have solid defensive tackles with good secondary help and big play linebackers that can roam sideline to sideline. That's where the 5-star recruits are, not on the edge like we've seen in recent years.
Yeah, so we got this game coming up with Missouri, and I think another concerning point for Alabama, and I don't know if it's going to show up against Mizzou necessarily, is this was probably the best running back tandem, if not trio, with Kenyon Drake before he got injured with T.J. Yeldon and Derrick Henry, and I just don't see it from week to week, and I think it's more injuries to those guys, specifically Yeldon's not himself, and also the offensive line for Alabama right now is not, it's very good, very good. Again, remember what the standards are here when I make some of these comments. But let's keep in mind what the standards are. So the offensive line is very capable, but it's not a dominant Barrett Jones, DJ Fluker, and company offensive line that we've seen in the past, and we don't see a dominant running game. You may have lost Joe here.
I'm back, Mark. I didn't hear the question. I apologize.
I was basically talking about the running game. I considered this the best trio of running backs in the country when we started the season. Of course, Kenyon Drake has been hurt, but T.J. Yeldon, Derrick Henry, I rated as 2 of the top 5 backs in the SEC. Henry doesn't get a whole lot of work. Well, he gets prominent work, but he's not the #1 guy. They rely on Yeldon in the clutch. He's been banged up. He's not himself. The offensive line is very capable, and I pointed out to some people when we lost you there for a second, when I talk about these standards, I'm talking about Alabama standards. The offensive line is very good, but it's not a dominant offensive line. So this running game is not a typical Eddie Lacy, T.J. Yeldon of yesteryear, Mark Ingram, great offensive line with Barrett Jones, DJ Fluker, and those guys. We could go on down the line type of Alabama rushing attack.
I agree with you, but it's a little bit different type of philosophy with offensive coordinator Lane Kiffin than it was under Jim McElwain and Doug Nussmeier. Under Jim McElwain and Doug Nussmeier, Alabama had a run-first mentality with those guys at Fluker, very solid in run blocking, which would open up the play-action passing game for A.J. McCarron. You're seeing a different philosophy under Lane Kiffin with Blake Sims now. They pass first. They're wide open attack. They have a big play wide receiver, best player in college football, in my opinion, in Amari Cooper on the outside, which stretches defenses vertically, puts a lot of pressure on opposing secondaries, and that has been opening up the rushing lanes for the offensive line. So it's a pass-first mentality now by Alabama where they're looking to stretch the field, opening up the defensive tackles and linebackers more, spreading them out in different types of formations, and then that seems to be opening up the rushing attack for Yeldon and Henry later in the ballgame. You saw what they were able to do within the fourth quarter against Auburn. After Amari Cooper burned that defense 3 times, it spread out the linebackers and secondary for Auburn, and then Alabama could run at will in the fourth quarter, and they wore down that Auburn defense. That's the difference this year than in years past where Alabama's had a very solid offensive line that pounds you in terms of rushing the football with a pound-first mentality. This year they're more wide open, and in my opinion, a more lethal offense at this point in the season.
Okay, let's focus on this championship game, and before I let you go, I'd love to talk about some Auburn and some Ole Miss, Mississippi State, but let's, while we're on the Alabama beat, let's talk about the championship game upcoming with Mizzou. This team is flawed, but has some very big playmakers in certain spots. It's easy to see the shortcomings from this Missouri football team, but they're very resourceful, and fortunately for them, the offense is playing better now than it was a month ago. Can you size things up for us with Bama Mizzou?
I don't think it's going to be a runaway. I think this will be a tough ball game for Alabama because of the secondary for Missouri. They've shown that they can play a wide-open attack against Texas A&M, against some other offenses later in the year, against Tennessee. They performed very, very well, and they do have speed on the edge with 2 big play defensive ends. So I think that'll put some pressure on Alabama's offensive line and create some problems for Lane Kiffin from an offensive perspective. It's going to be on the offense for Gary Pinkel and his staff. Matty Mock, a little bit inconsistent. You look at that game last week at home against Arkansas, they picked up over 400 yards of total offense. 285 of those came in the second half of the ballgame. Gary Pinkel and his staff have done an excellent job in terms of making halftime adjustments. You can look at the last 3 games against Arkansas, Texas A&M, and on the road against Tennessee, where they made halftime adjustments to win those ball games. They seem to be a second-half team. They need this game to be in the low 20s in order to have any opportunity to knock off Alabama, because if Alabama jumps up early, I'm not so sure Matty Mock and that offense could come back the way they played this year. Not that explosive in terms of putting up points at will. So I think that look for Missouri to run the football with Hansborough, get into a low-scoring affair, work off field position in that defense. I think they can keep it close, but in the end, Mark, I still think Alabama gets about a 7-point victory on Saturday. I don't think it's a blowout. I think it's a very close game due to the secondary of Missouri. I think they match up very well with DeAndrew White and Amari Cooper and can create some pressure on Blake Sims. But it's the offense for Missouri that I'm not sold on at this point in the season.
Yeah, I haven't seen the point spread on this game. I would guess it's in the range of 12. I would hope so. I would think so, considering Georgia Tech was 12 or 13. Considering that Auburn was like a 7.5 to 9 point fluctuating line last week against Alabama for the Iron Bowl, that Mizzou would be a pretty heavy favorite. It's going to be difficult for them to score big points with the passing game and running the football on this defense, despite what we saw against Auburn. I know that Gary Pinkel's going to work trying to figure out what the Auburn Tigers and Nick Marshall were able to carve up in that Alabama secondary, and it all came back to Marshall's big playability on the edge and his dual threat ability being something that Matty Mock doesn't have. He's pretty mobile quarterback, but nothing explosive like Nick Marshall, and Marshall just had a field day, 456 through the air. I don't know what he rushed for, but he was dynamic in this game and kept with those two wide receivers, Sammy Coates and Duke Williams, also Quan Bray. They were tough for Alabama to handle. There are no great teams in college football. I don't think there's any doubt about that. So we got Bama winning by 7 over Mizzou. That's going to be a better game than I would expect if that's what it turns out to be, Joe. What do you make of this Auburn situation? They look like a top 5 team early in the even to mid in the season. They fell apart to a certain extent. They gave us a great game against Bama, almost pulled off the upset through 3 quarters. Now they fire Ellis Johnson, their defensive coordinator. So the recruiting rankings would tell us that Auburn has recruited superior talent on that side of the football, but they have just not been a good defensive team, even in winning or almost winning the national championship, winning the SEC in 2013. They were not an elite defense. I think the loss of D. Ford really hurt this team, and then they lost the freshman Lawson, had the great freshman year in 2013. He was hurt in training camp, could possibly come back for a bowl game, but they really missed an edge rush, and their secondary has just been obliterated the last 2 years. So this is a team that has won with offense, but they're looking for a different feel on defense. What do you see when you see this Auburn defense on the field?
Well, the one thing that I do like about the Auburn defense is that, and I was very impressed in the road against Kansas State earlier in the year and against some games midway through the season, their ability to tackle in space, which is in the secondary, which to me is a very important aspect when you look at a defense. They were only giving up, going into that game against Alabama, 142 rushing yards per game. It's not great, but it's not bad either, and they were able to really stuff some good rushing teams earlier in the season. In my opinion, just think the schedule. You look at the schedule for Auburn entering this year, we knew it would be one of the top schedules in the nation, and as the season progressed, that defense sort of wore down late in the year. So you look at this defense, I think that they're very good in run support, can create turnovers, which they showed at the early part of the season and early in the first half against Alabama, but they're going to need some help on the defensive line and the linebackers. Chris Frost, in my opinion, is a solid linebacker, but they're going to have to put a couple of guys next to him that can roam sideline to sideline and create some pressure in terms of quarterback sacks. It's another area where Auburn struggled this year, giving quarterbacks time. Blake Sims had a lot of time in that fourth quarter. They couldn't get a pass rush on him, and that allowed him to hit some big plays to Amari Cooper later in the ball game, and that affected the defense as well. You have to be able to create pressure, especially in today's college game where 90% of the offenses throw at will on defenses. So I think going forward they need a coach, a tough-minded coach that runs a different type of system, more of a 3-4 type of approach. Ellis Johnson ran, I believe it was a 5-2-4 type of defense, which is more suited to a spread offense. Only 2 linebackers at certain points in the season. That doesn't hold up against solid rushing offenses in the SEC.
Joe Lisi joins us from GoForThe2.com. Ellis Johnson out as defensive coordinator at Auburn, hired in December of 2012, so he had those 2 stays with the Auburn Tigers going to the BCS championship game, then followed up by this late season collapse. 10th in the SEC in scoring defense, allowing 26 points per game, 9th in total defense at 389 yards per game. All right, Joe, before we let you go, we got Mississippi State losing to Ole Miss. You hit that one on the head with the Rebels winning by 14. I think you called it by 6. Rebels pull off the upset at home. Mississippi State apparently out of it at 10-2, but there is some talk that if everything breaks loose elsewhere, that the Bulldogs could make it happen. I think we got to see what the Rebels are all about. Still banged up that Hugh Freeze pulled out all the stops in winning the Egg Bowl.
Yeah, it was their ability to make big plays. You saw Bo Wallace attack that Mississippi State secondary over the middle of the field with Ingram, big plays down the middle of the field. And their ability to shut down the rushing attack for Mississippi State. They held Josh Robinson in tech and forced Dak Prescott to beat him with his arm, which he could not do. They forced Mississippi State to methodically work down the field. They had a solid defensive game plan in the red zone, and that's why they won that ball game. We talked about Dak Prescott's inability going into that game. Over the last 6 ball games, he threw 8 INTs on the year. They negated Josh Robinson, created some turnovers when they had to, and in my opinion, it was the defensive line that really set the tone of that ball game. They got some pressure on Dak Prescott early, set the tone that he was not going to beat him with his legs. And that really, in my opinion, was the turning point of the game. And then Bo Wallace, he missed on some early throws down the middle of the field in the first half. He connected on them in the second half, and it was Ole Miss's ability to make big plays where Mississippi State could not.
So I know we've knocked it around, best 2 loss, best 3 loss, but Ole Miss, I'm going to say it right now, over UCLA, best 3 loss team in the country. At 9-3, and they were oh so close from staying in this championship race. Joe Lisi joins us from GoForThe2.com. But before I let you go, Joe, you don't really have time to research this, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway, just because this was an argument on Twitter yesterday. Missouri wins the SEC championship game. Who represents the SEC in the college football playoff?
Well, I think if Missouri wins the SEC championship, there's a possibility that we might not see one SEC team in the playoff. I mean, because if Ohio State can knock off Wisconsin without J.T. Barrett, you have to give them serious consideration for the playoff. I don't care that J.T. Barrett's not going to play. If they can knock off Wisconsin in the Big Ten championship game, in my opinion, Ohio State has to be mentioned. They only have 1 loss on the year that came earlier in the year at home to Virginia Tech. They righted the ship, and if they can win without their quarterback, J.T. Barrett, and without Braxton Miller, you have to give Urban Meyer credit, and they deserve to be mentioned. Another team, if TCU wins out this weekend, and then you look at Baylor, in my opinion, TCU would still go at this point in the season because of Baylor's close victory against Texas Tech this weekend. So I think if Missouri wins, the top 4 would be Florida State, Oregon, if they win the Pac-12 championship, TCU, and then Ohio State, in my opinion. I don't think the SEC has a representative if Missouri wins the SEC championship game this weekend.
All right, there you go. Joe Lisi from GoForThe2.com. Join him there. And join us every Tuesday night on Google Hangouts. We do our top 25 rundown, so we're going to predict and preview all the championship games, again, late night with Joe on Google Hangouts, and that's, of course, on my YouTube channel as well as a podcast, Mark Rogers TV. All right, Joe, you have yourself a good day.
You too, Mark. I'll see you tomorrow night. Always a pleasure.
Again, Joe Lisi from GoForThe2.com. We appreciate Joe because you can throw in any game in the country, and he is going to come with his research, and he is ready to go. And talk about a guy that's always ready to go. We got Stephen M. Smith coming on board from touchdownalabama.net, the guy that never sleeps, the no-sleep team, still in full go with the Iron Bowl in its past. So, Stephen M., how are you today?
Doing just fine. I got me a good 2-hour nap yesterday, so I feel good.
You got yourself 2 hours in. Wow.
Hey, I had to get that done, Mark. That was one thing I had to get done.
Well, that's good to know that you're getting your sleep in. So, wow, 55-44, and Auburn had as much as a 12-point lead in this game, and that looked not like a secure lead considering the way these offenses were moving the ball, but I don't think anybody anticipated what that fourth quarter was going to bring. Let's start with Mr. Cooper, because he is special. What really separates Amari Cooper, in your opinion, Stephen M., from everybody else?
Just his competitiveness, his ability to. He has such a feel for the game, especially against Auburn on Saturday night. Amari Cooper played with a heavy brace on his left knee, but it didn't seem to bother him. He looked fluent in route running. He built that connection with Blake Sims. He put some mean double moves on Jonathan Mincy, Jonathan Jones, and also Jonathan Ford. All three defensive backs for Auburn put some mean double moves on all three players and was able to create that separation, get open, and give Blake Sims that confidence that once Cooper is open, let the ball go, let your guy make some big-time plays on the field. And Amari Cooper did just that. I mean, 13 catches, 224 yards, and 3 touchdowns. Amari Cooper equalized his output he had against Tennessee a couple of months ago when he had 224 yards receiving against the Volunteers. Amari Cooper, a very talented player, especially when he's able to recognize his matchups, create separation immediately off the line of scrimmage, and just flash that speed, those great hands, and also his ability to – he's a very savvy route runner. Nobody gives him enough credit for that, because against Auburn, you saw where there were routes that were supposed to go to the outside. Amari Cooper would fake like he's going to the outside and give a mean move to the inside, just completely befuddling and fooling the defensive backs of Auburn. He goes to the inside and just gets completely open. You never want to lose coverage against number 9 of Alabama. You never want to lose containment against Amari Cooper, and Auburn's secondary often lost containment against Cooper, and they paid the price for it. Amari Cooper, a big-time game, a big-time performance, and in my opinion, that should be enough for him to win, to go to New York for the Heisman Trophy presentation. But just to be on the safe side, I feel like Mr. Cooper should duplicate that same performance against Missouri on next Saturday in Atlanta.
Yeah, the one play in particular where he ran the post pattern, and you mentioned him faking to the out, then he goes to the post, and they had, even though the hash marks aren't that wide like they were at one point in college football, that you can take advantage of this type of situation, but Alabama, the ball was as far pretty much to the left hash as possible, and they had all that wide open space to the right, and he was pretty much isolated. There's a lot of ground out there to cover for a DB to be in that much space with a guy like Amari Cooper. It's just basically not fair. All right, Stephen M., these 3 picks by Blake Sims, some of them bad decisions. The other ones, he went to the right guy but made a bad throw. Any concern there, Blake Sims, going forward?
No concern of Blake Sims going forward. He did have an ankle injury in the second half, was hobbling a bit, but the ankle had no role in him throwing the 3 interceptions. It goes back to it's a rivalry game, and in rivalry games you have to put the ball in the right spots and lead your football team. Blake Sims battled some nerves there. When he targeted Amari Cooper, he was 13 of 16 passing when targeting Amari Cooper for 3 touchdowns and 1 interception. And when he's targeting other receivers, I think he went 7 of 11 and had 1 touchdown with 2 interceptions. So I feel like in a lot of those interception situations, Auburn was able to kind of take away Amari Cooper and force Blake Sims to find somebody else, and Blake Sims found himself double clutching, especially on his 3rd interception, which took place in the 3rd quarter. Sims wants to go to Amari Cooper on the slant route. Cooper wasn't there, so he double clutches and tries to find Christian Jones on the little hitch and go route, and Jonathan Jones recognizes it and breaks in front of the football and gets the interception for the Auburn Tigers. So for Blake Sims, it was a battle of trying to calm his nerves down in a huge Iron Bowl, in a huge rivalry game. And one thing I have to say is you can't question the resiliency of Blake Sims, because after the third interception, you can clearly see Jake Coker, a Florida State transfer, Jake Coker, getting loose on the sidelines. And many Alabama fans thought that they would see Jake Coker in the ball game. But Nick Saban, offensive coordinator Lane Kiffin, not giving up on Sims. They continue to go with Blake Sims. And after his third interception of the game, he rewards the decision made by the coaching staff to stick with him by going 10 for 12 passing and tossing 4 touchdowns, well, having 4 total touchdowns. He tossed for 3, ran for 1. So after that third interception, Blake Sims just has an incredible turnaround in that second half, has 3 passing touchdowns, 1 rushing score, and just really rewarding the coaching staff for having the confidence in him to finish the game. So just the resiliency of Blake Sims for keeping it going when it felt like he was coming completely unraveled was just tremendous. He did a great job in the second half of composing himself, getting back to what he does, which is feeding Amari Cooper the football and also using his legs. Blake Sims used his legs more in the second half, but I got to give Lane Kiffin credit of going back to the run game. You saw a lot in the second half. Alabama went back to the run game. They allowed the offensive line to establish some dominance up front and allowing T.J. Yeldon and Derrick Henry to get to the edge and run the football. So that was also key in that game. Alabama getting back to running the football, getting back to having the offensive line block up front and do a great job of setting the edge in the run game for T.J. Yeldon and Derrick Henry. Alabama's running backs, they totaled 227 yards rushing. They averaged 6.7 yards per carry and 4 touchdowns. I felt like that was huge for Alabama. Another stat that was huge, red zone offense. Auburn had the ball in the red zone 8 times. They only got 2 touchdowns, 5 field goals in the red zone for Auburn. Alabama had the ball in the red area 5 times. They scored a touchdown on all 5 of those possessions. And another huge stat, Auburn collectively was held to 174 yards rushing. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? This was a rushing attack that was lethal last season in the Iron Bowl. They rushed for, I believe, 350 yards against Alabama last year. Now, credit they had Trey Mason, credit they had Jay Prosh, credit they had Greg Robinson last year, but Cameron Artis-Payne still potent. You have a good quarterback in Nick Marshall who can run the football. Corey Grant can run the football. And Alabama held this rushing attack to 174 yards rushing, 3.7 yards per carry. Huge job by Alabama's defense in that regard.
Yeah, it's impressive. It's impressive, no doubt. Gus Malzahn put this game on Nick Marshall's shoulders, and he almost pulled it off. Nick Marshall's such an improved passer. I am done questioning Nick Marshall as a passer. Is he ever going to be Peyton Manning or Tom Brady? No. But for a college quarterback with the dynamic playmaking ability that he has on the edge, he can also sling it just about as well as anybody. You know, you mentioned Blake Sims, and I completely agree. I think what we see there is his resiliency goes back to 5 years of sweat equity in this program and with these teammates, and I think they really pull together. They really play well. You've addressed it much better than I could in previous weeks about this Alabama team being a tight-knit group that maybe made some mistakes mid-season, maybe didn't look like the best team in the country many times, but the cohesiveness of this team, and in particular the offensive unit, I think these guys really play for Blake Sims, and I just think that they're really close, and all the workouts and all the film study and him standing in line behind everybody else. And lastly, A.J. McCarron has really paid off, and he, again, has so much equity in this program. and everybody loves him. And he may not be the best or the most talented, but he's talented enough to win a national championship. All right, Stephen M. Missouri. What do you see when you see the Tigers, and how do they look to you, and do they pose any kind of serious threat in this one?
Missouri is a good football team. You look at head coach Gary Pinko has done an outstanding job. He's guided this Missouri team to the SEC title game for the second year in a row. I look at Missouri's offense. It kind of mimics Auburn to some degree. The difference is Auburn a little bit more run-happy, Missouri a little bit more pass-happy. You look at the Missouri receivers led by Bud Sasser and Jimmy Hunt. Both guys very talented. Both guys physical receivers, can go up. They have a great catching radius. Both guys are pretty savvy route runners. And you look at Missouri's run game with Marcus Murphy and Russell Hansbrough, two very talented backs. Russell Hansbrough had a light ankle sprain against Arkansas, according to Gary Pinko, but Russell Hansbrough will be in practice this week for Missouri as they look to really compete and try to win this SEC title game against Alabama next Saturday. But the main thing that Missouri has defensively, I feel like defensively Missouri has improved a lot, especially on the defensive line. The back five is still kind of iffy for the Tigers, but the front four for Missouri, very talented, can really get after the passer. They have great leverage. The linebacking core of Missouri is pretty sound, but this is a team that offensively, like I said, mimics Auburn, but a little bit more pass-happy. You look at Matty Mauk, on deep routes, he's been accurate, but on the short to intermediate passing routes is where Matty Mauk has had a lot of his concerns on. His accuracy tends to be a little bit inconsistent on short to intermediate routes. He tends to throw the ball behind receivers. He tends to overthrow receivers. He tends to get a little bit too impatient on those short to intermediate routes. But when he has time to throw the football, Matty Mauk, one of the best gunslingers in the country, when he has time to really set his feet, really scan the field, and release the football. So he's a good quarterback. He's a polished passer when it comes down to the deep routes. On the short to intermediate routes, tend to have his difficulties there. But this is a Missouri team that if you don't come out on fire right away and establish yourself defensively, this is a Missouri team that can dominate you and can beat you. And Alabama head coach Nick Saban has stressed that this week in practice, Alabama will look to really improve on secondary play, improve on game against Missouri, against Matty Mauk, and also from an offensive standpoint, Alabama really looks to clean up the mistakes and establish the run game and get some cohesiveness going with not just Blake Sims and Amari Cooper, but Blake Sims and the other talent at the receiver position that Alabama has. But this is going to be a very intriguing matchup between Alabama and Missouri. I mean, I look forward to watching it.
All right, Stephen M., before we let you go, Alabama loses this game. Do they make the playoff?
I think that's in the hands of the committee right there because it's tough. It's tough if you look at it. I mean, it's tough. I mean, Mississippi State is presumably out.
You're on the committee right now, Stephen M.
I mean, if I'm on the committee right, oh gosh, it'd be difficult because you look at Florida State, they just continue to win. Oregon continues to win. TCU, I mean, continuing to win, and then you have Ohio State that just comes out of absolute nowhere. It will be difficult right now. I can't.
That didn't answer my question. That's all right. Stephen M., we appreciate it. We're going to have you on, of course, in the upcoming weeks. Would like to get your thoughts about a number of things involving the SEC. So Stephen M. Smith joins us from touchdownalabama.net, and if we ran down all the platforms that this guy's on, we would be here for the rest of the show. So we'll start with touchdownalabama.net, and then you can follow him from there, ESPN_future on Twitter. Stephen M., you have yourself a great day, sir.
You too, Mark, and thanks so much for your time.
Definitely. Always got time for you. All right. Before I get to Brittnee Taylor, I want to clarify something here. I ran down my 4 top teams headed up by Florida State, which goes against everybody else, it seems. Florida State #1, Oregon 2, even gave them the nod over Alabama at 3, Ohio State at 4. These are not who I consider to be necessarily the 4 best teams in the country in that order. If Alabama's playing on a neutral field against Florida State or Oregon, I'll take the Tide. I believe that Florida State, on the validation of 0 losses, should be ranked #1, regardless of how it was accomplished. #1, then you rank the 1-loss teams from there. All right, let's bring in Brittnee Taylor Newman from football.com and also Last Word on Sports. Brittnee, how are you?
Hey, I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing just fine. So, wow, we have close to the regular season now. Alabama, Missouri, and we've got a Heisman race. We have all sorts of stuff going on. So whatever you'd like to talk about, you get us started, and we'll go from there.
Okay. Well, one thing that I found really interesting from the end, the upheaval and rivalry weekend, was just sort of the emergence of this large juxtaposition of power in the SEC right now. You have over the weekend, as I'm sure you've already talked about so far on the show, you had 4 SEC teams who lost to ACC teams. South Carolina to Clemson, Kentucky to Louisville, Florida to Florida State, and then the one that I found to be the most surprising, Georgia to Georgia Tech. The Bulldogs were favored by a couple of touchdowns in that game, and the Yellow Jackets have beat them, I think, once in 13 contests. I think this is the second win in 14 games. So that one, to me, was the most surprising. But there's this very interesting dichotomy there, because you've got certain teams from the SEC that weren't even able to compete with ACC teams, which has widely been regarded one of the weaker conferences because they've sort of gone back and forth this year. But at the same time, on the flip side of things, our college football playoff ranking is 5 weeks old, and 4 out of those 5 weeks you've had at least 2 SEC West teams that have been in the top 4 the whole way through. So I don't know that I'm at a point yet where I'm ready to say that the SEC will never be the strongest conference in college football again, as they've been over the last 15 years. But certainly we've never seen as much of a gap in talent as we've seen this year, which I think is really, really interesting. And the question that it raised for me is, with the loss of Mississippi State to Ole Miss, they're kind of out of contention for the top 4 now. If Auburn had been able to pull off the upset, as it looked like they might do at one point in the second half, and Alabama had lost, is there a chance that a 2-loss Alabama team would have been able to make it into the playoff, or could we have actually found ourselves going into a college football playoff without any SEC representation, which would have been really interesting, considering that we spent most of the year trying to figure out how many teams from the SEC would make it into the playoff.
Brittnee, I will preface this by saying that I do believe that the SEC is still the best conference. I think that the Pac-12 is #2. I think that it would have been nice to have seen the 2 conferences play at some point this year, especially considering the SEC plays 56 non-conference games. That's 14 times 4. 56 non-conference games. Couldn't find it available to play the Pac-12, and the Pac-12 did not schedule the SEC as well. Let's take off the blinders of the groupthink that the SEC is the best conference just for a second, for objectivity's sake, and that the SEC has been dominant in the past. So we're just going to take this season and forget what's happened in the past and the establishment of dominance. Let's just look at this season objectively. If you run down the wins and losses for the SEC outside the conference, so again, I know a lot is given to the Alabamas and Mississippi States and Ole Misses when they beat each other, and wow, their schedule's so hard and they have to play each other. Okay, that's very subjective because that's within a vacuum. It's not compared against the other conferences. You just take the 11 games that they played and went 5-6 against the other Power 5 conferences. And I did this. I cut a video after much was made about this 4 straight for the ACC, that the ACC went 10-6 against very comparable teams outside of the ACC. And so the ACC actually performed better than the SEC against the other Power 5 conference teams. Now, in these four particular games, I don't know if you heard me off the top of the show, I disclaimed these, being that Florida State's the 1 seed, Florida would be an 8 seed in the SEC, and on down the line. Clemson a 3, South Carolina a 10, Louisville a 4, Kentucky's the second worst team in the SEC. So credit winning on the field, credit the games are scheduled, these are natural rivalries that are scheduled every year. So the ACC took care of business. We cannot take those 4 games this past Saturday and leap it forward to a statement that the ACC is better than the SEC. As you mentioned, the only comparable game is really Georgia Tech. That's the only thing we can take any kind of weight from, I believe, because they're pretty comparable teams with pretty comparable seedings within their respective leagues. So Brittnee brings a pretty good perspective on this, being a writer for both the ACC and the SEC for Football.com and Last Word on Sports. So what else do we need to dive into?
Well, obviously it's that time of year when coaching changes are coming our way. Auburn already has fired their defensive coordinator, and I'm interested to see if there will be any rumblings of Will Muschamp being picked up to head to Auburn and coach under Gus Malzahn. I think that could be a really, really great pairing. I'm open to hear on Twitter today how Tigers fans feel about that possibility, if that's something that they'd be excited about. But that was kind of first thought that came to my mind when I heard about the vacancy was I think, Will Muschamp will make a great head coach eventually. I think, he maybe wasn't quite ready for the opportunity that he had at Florida. He's a fantastic defensive coordinator, so I'd be interested to see if he'll end up returning to the coordinator position at a major school or taking a head coaching position at a smaller school. But Tiger fans, you can reach out to us on Twitter today and let us know what you think about that matchup.
Yeah, Will Muschamp can coach defense. There's no question about that. And if he definitely has an advocate in his corner in Nick Saban, who knows defense himself, and they work together at LSU. And Nick Saban has sung the praises of one Will Muschamp a number of times, so he has that on his resume. And Will Muschamp came very close. If you really go through his time at Florida, he came within a couple bounces of the ball of having a much better stay at Florida. But that's the way things turn out. Sometimes you see these coaches lose a game or two late in the season, and I know his fate was sealed quite a ways ago. But there's a fine line, especially in a conference as competitive as the SEC, from succeeding or at least being tolerated to being the guy that's got to get kicked out of town. So we got Alabama and Missouri. It seems like a bit of a mismatch. I don't know if you've got many thoughts on this one already, Taylor.
Oh,
did I just call you Taylor?
You did.
Yeah, Brittnee, I'm sorry.
No, I think I'm with the media in general on this one. I don't know that there's much of a matchup here. I hate to minimize the efforts of Missouri, but based on what we've seen from them this season, I kind of think this will be a little bit of a blowout by Alabama. And Nick Saban certainly left that game Saturday night, and at the press conference talked about how that game was a little bit of a gut check for them, and seeing some of the other losses in the SEC, particularly with Mississippi State, was a little bit of a gut check. They're fully aware of the position that they're in and that they've got to win through to be able to go to the playoffs. So I think he's going to bring his guys in fired up, and I hate to minimize the efforts of Missouri, but I'm not sure that there's much they'll be able to do in this game.
Yeah, if you look at the way they performed for most of the year, they've hung on. They've done what they've had to do. They do have that 34-0 shellacking by Georgia in their back pocket, as well as a loss to Indiana that everybody loves to bring up. But they have made it. They are 7-1 after a 7-1 last year. So Missouri, for the record, it's in the books, the best record in the SEC over the last 2 years at 14-2. So they've played the schedule and they've won the games they had to. And while everybody was clamoring for Georgia to break through as the best team in the East, they didn't get it done despite the head-to-head win. So we're left with Alabama, Missouri, and Missouri might be the 5th or 6th best team in the conference. And but that's what we have, and that's why we have divisions and have the setup that we have. So before I let you go, Brittnee, unless there's anything else you'd like to throw out there, I would love to get your thoughts on this College Football Playoff Committee decision coming up on Tuesday night, and more so, we could go through a zillion different scenarios, so we'll not get too crazy. But if Missouri does beat Alabama, what are your thoughts about how they could possibly be judged? aside from everyone when I bring that up.
Yeah, that becomes tricky because then you're really just kind of going by that eye test, which I know is your favorite thing ever, because we know that Alabama is one of the premier teams in the country, but when you're looking at an Alabama that's lost to Ole Miss and another loss to Missouri at that point, if that scenario were to come true, I think it would become very, very difficult to justify taking them in the top 4, especially when you start looking at some of the power index rankings. And to be honest, I don't know if the committee looks at that information, but as you said, there's kind of the emergence of the Pac-12 and some different conferences that have really stood out this year. I think that argument is very hard to make, taking a 2-loss SEC team. So I think Alabama will get it done. I don't think they'll put the committee in that position, but anything's possible this season. We've already seen that. But yeah, we'll see. I think Alabama will get it done, though. I think Blake Sims will kind of cement his place in the Heisman conversation on Saturday, and all will go forward as normal and expected in the world of college football.
I really think it will as well. There is opportunity for Armageddon if you look at every conference championship game. It's kind of funny, aside from Florida State, Georgia Tech, where you've got, of course, the Seminoles with no losses, every 1-loss team is playing a 2-loss team. That would automatically set up the dilemma that if the 2-loss team beat the 1-loss team, they both have 2 losses, and suddenly the team that was not considered, nobody's considering Wisconsin, Missouri, Arizona, Georgia Tech, suddenly has the head-to-head, and they've got the same record. And now we've got this glut of teams all over the place that we can only fit down to 4, and wouldn't that be a lot of fun?
Wouldn't that be fun for college football fans? We'd love to duke it out with the committee over that. And I've got to say, I'm surprised you didn't take the opportunity to go ahead and roast me publicly for my prediction that it would be Mississippi State and Georgia in the SEC championship game. I guaranteed it on your show about 2 months ago.
You did guarantee it, a la Joe Namath. Still, you eloquently brought your case, and see, I can't jump on that because although I did pick Alabama preseason, I held the chalk, and wow, that was a really difficult decision to make at that point, going out on a limb with Alabama. I picked South Carolina, so I really have no bullets to fire at anyone.
Okay, fair enough, fair enough.
So we've got Brittnee Taylor Newman from Football.com. I was on Football.com this morning. There must be 1,000 writers on there. Checked out some of the work. I've been on there before. Brittnee does an exceptional job covering the ACC and the SEC, and there's a whole ton of information there. And also joins us from Last Word on Sports as well. Brittnee, have a great day. We appreciate the time.
You too. See you soon.
All right, this is the SEC in 60. We come your way every Monday at noon Eastern and 11 Central. Join the podcast at MarkRogersTV on Podbean or at iTunes. We get that uploaded in just a few hours. And then, of course, we're available on the SEC Radio Network, SECRadioNetwork.com. This is the venture from Dr. SEC, Peter Flournoy. Each and every weekday, we are on the SEC Radio Network at 2 o'clock Eastern and 1 o'clock Central. Follow me on Twitter. We talk up some college football on Twitter. And again, the debate yesterday was if Mizzou beats Alabama, 2 losses versus 2 losses, who makes it from the SEC? Does anybody make it from the SEC? Of course, there's a zillion other factors outside the SEC that affect that, but it's just fun for debate because I, for one, again, the argument is head-to-head. They have 3 common opponents in Tennessee, Arkansas, and Texas A&M. Mizzou handled those 3 just about as well as Alabama did. And if you're the SEC champion and you won the head-to-head, especially against number 1, put Mizzou in the playoff over Alabama. The other thing to keep in mind is this college football rankings is going to set us up for what could happen on championship week. So that number 4 spot is going to be extremely interesting between TCU, Baylor, and Ohio State to see what the committee thinks, how they determine the J.T. Barrett injury at Ohio State. I think it should be completely discounted. Let the boy play, the third-string quarterback, Cardell Jones. Let Ohio State play with the third-string quarterback. Let's see how they play against Wisconsin. If they win the game, they win the game. They're probably going to need some style points. Unfortunately, I'm not a big advocate of style points. I think the system has placed the College Football Playoff Committee in the place of having to look at style points It's inevitable because you have to separate teams with the same record. I would love an objective system, but I will not dive into that right now. Check me out at Mark Rogers TV on YouTube because I've got plenty of videos where I break down how I would set it up with formula scheduling and objective rankings, not based on people's opinion. So right now we've got the SEC in 60, and we appreciate your time. Catch us again next week, again, Monday at noon, live on Google Hangouts, and we've got it on all sorts of platforms after that throughout the week. Podcasts and video, check us out there. So Missouri, Alabama, enjoy the game. We will catch you again next week.